amendment at the desk. This is another 001, but this is the small one.
Amendment to committee plan offered by...
I ask the consent that the amendment be considered as read.
And the gentleman is recognized. Mr. Chairman, in the last several... Oh, I should assume the gentleman is recognized. It's being distributed. I'll wait until it's distributed. We'll wait to distribute.
The gentleman may proceed.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Chairman, in the last several months, it's clearly been my impression, and many others here I think as well, that there's a developing consensus that the Federal Reserve should be given less power, not more. And I know we've had a little debate as to whether you do that to an institution that has made glaring mistakes in the past, especially institutions that have not had any change in personnel. But regardless of that, in reading over this discussion draft, I'm struck by how much additional power is given to it. And as discussed, although not singled out as a systemic uber-regulator name, I think we all understand that we're not going to be fooled by that the Fed is really given primary supervision over firms identified as too big to fail, as well as an array of other new powers. One of the new powers particularly caught my attention. That's, if you turn to page 30 of the bill, section 1104, subsection 5, it's on line item 17, page 30 of the bill, mitigation of systemic risk. Interesting enough here is what? The Fed essentially, and the board essentially, will be able to dismember, preemptively force a company to sell off portions of it under one of two circumstances. One, if it's a threat to the safety and soundness of the financial stability of the United States, in other words, a systemic risk to the entire country, or if it's merely a threat to the safety and soundness of the company itself, perhaps not having any impact whatsoever on the safety and soundness or the stability as a systemic risk to the economy in general. Amazingly broad powers is therefore being given to the Fed, unlimited authority to basically systemically, if you will, dismantle a private company. Now, this is a lot more sweeping than imposing tougher capital standards, which I think members from both sides of the aisle would agree can and should be used in circumstances to restrain the growth of certain depository and other institutions. Now, I do understand that the gentleman from Pennsylvania is contemplating an amendment that I believe is similar to this section of the underlying bill, and I'll be happy to take a look at that at a later date when we hear that. But right now we're focusing on this, and I would ask that you consider this. The motivation behind such language that's in the draft bill. If you consider that the majority, if the majority truly believes that they have done away with the idea of a moral hazard due to the liquidation-only receivership of the proposed resolution, in other words, that that is the threat that's out there. If the majority believes that they have set up a system in place of the regulators to be able to constrain the size of companies by their capital requirements and the other powers that the regulators have, if you have that in place, then the counterparties of these large institutions should be taking that into account, and by that basis, this section of the bill really is unnecessary. Given the extraordinary government interventions into private firms we've already seen, with the trampling of the rule of law in order to benefit political favorites in the auto bankruptcies, for instance, I'm really very uncomfortable with this sweeping, unchecked power, especially for an entity that we know and have seen has failed to effectively regulate many of the large bank holding companies already under its purview. We already have antitrust laws, we already have bankruptcy laws, we already have the idea of capital requirements, we already have the idea that is mentioned with regards to the counterparties taking into these factors as well. This language is merely strike this and strike the aspect of allowing the Fed to have the ability to preemptively destroy and take apart these large institutions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes to talk strongly in opposition. As the gentleman indicated, we intend actually to go further. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kanjorski, want to go even further. But first, let me make clear, this is not some unrestricted grant of authority to the Federal Reserve. These are powers that are only coming to play vis-a-vis institutions that the Systemic Risk Council has identified as causing problems. And what we have here are a set of tools that the Federal Reserve may use pursuant to such a declaration.
With it, gentlemen?
Yes.
I know the word problems, and you're just using that liberally here. The language, though, on page 30 doesn't say problems. The language says that they have the ability, and you're right, it's the board, it's not just the Fed. The language here says the board has this ability when a company gets so big that it poses a threat to the safety and soundness of such company. So you can have a company that simply gets very large, and it's just teetering because it just can't manage itself, and it's going to collapse because it's so big. But it's so big that it's not going to necessarily have an impact because it's not interconnected. It doesn't have a lot of derivatives tradings and all the swaps and everything else that's not wrongly traded like AIG did. But this.
But I'll take back my time to say to the gentleman.
Yep.
But it says, if you'll notice, of an identified financial holding company, it is triggered by the Systemic Risk Council's finding. So, and the board then has to consult with the prudential regulators. But again, this is not unrestricted power to the Federal Reserve. I would also say, and there's a difference between us, it's not that the gentleman, and we had this debate earlier, is putting the power elsewhere. It is power that he wants no one in the federal government to have. We believe, and we're going to make this clear, I voted against the Graham-Leach-Braley Act. I do believe that it's important for somewhere in the federal government there to be the power to say, A, you are too big, or B, you are too complex and too self-contradictory. We will also have an amendment dealing with proprietary trading. The Federal Reserve, however, cannot do this on its own. This is a power triggered by a determination by the Systemic Risk Council that the given entity is a systemic risk. Again, this is not in the abstract because they're too big or too complex. And the question, I can see members saying, well, we don't want the Federal Reserve to have it. Others should have it. That's what the Senate appears to be saying. I think that's a mistake. I think this is a fairly circumscribed role for the Federal Reserve to do these things in accordance with, first, the determination by the Risk Council, secondly, with the consultation with the prudential regulator of each entity, and finally, with some due process rights to appeal this, which we have put in there. So this is the question. I understand we keep being told there's a difference of opinion.
Gentlemen, yield on that?
I'll yield. I'll give myself an additional 2 minutes, and I'll yield to the gentleman.
We obviously are going to disagree on the fundamental aspect of whether we should have this general power in there. I understand that. But more to the more limited point, the language is in the bill right now and doesn't say that, well, here, let me pose it to you as a question. What does the board, not the Fed, what does the board have to show? I mean, what does the board is, what does the board have to show in these hearings to determine that they're able to do this? I read it as saying that they just poses a threat or safety to the soundness of the company. Well, the
gentleman, I'll take back my time. Yep. On page 2, it says, because it refers, page 2, line 17, the term identified financial holding company means a financial company that the council, not the Fed, has identified for heightened prudential standards. Okay. So that's the trigger. That these are powers that are exercised pursuant to a finding by the Systemic Risk Council. That's the condition that's a prerequisite for the Federal Reserve to act. So that's a major restriction on the power. They can only do it with regard to a company that has been identified by the Systemic Risk Council as in need of this. I'll yield again.
And I guess I'm still searching there. Okay, so now they found the XYZ company, the council has identified a company, a holding company, has identified it for for heightened prudential standards. But once they get to the next part to say whether or not we're going to now cut them up or dismantle them, what have you, all it says on page 30 is that the board has determined that they pose a threat to the company. It doesn't say that that company, in either here or over there, just because you have a company that's a heightened standard, doesn't say that they actually are a systemic risk to the entire.
No, the gentleman's wrong. What? An identified financial company is one that has been. The phrase "identified financial company" is defined in page 5. Okay. That line is subparagraph 5.